continuing together with Rabbi Steif's Mitzvos Hashem, the commandments that God Almighty lovingly has given to every single human being, Dinei B'nai Noach, what applies to every single human being in all times and all places. And we're particularly delving in over here into a commandment that is, on one hand, it's seemingly just given to the children of Israel. The God Almighty says, don't follow in the ways, don't go in the habits of the non-Jewish nations that are living in the land of Canaan, that are living in that we saw in Egypt. Don't follow these ways, and we're going to see in what way do these commandments also apply to non-Jews also. That there's a certain common thread in all these commandments. Commandments are saying, don't go after behaviors and conduct and customs that are focused on putting the primacy in the belief that this world, the physical world, is the only world that we have, it's the only existence we have. Things that are promoting idolatry, believing in other forces that need to be placated in order to have a good life, and trying to get the most experiences from this world through immorality, things that are going to promote theft. And really, we're going to see today, when some of what we're going to learn further, but we have to, every human being, a Jew and a non-Jew, has to look forward to what is the picture, what is the vision that God Almighty has for every single human being. And we can understand that if we look at the prophets. The prophets discuss what is going to be like when the redemption comes, when Mashiach comes. And it says that the knowledge of God Almighty is going to fill the earth like the waters fill the ocean. Meaning to say that when you go to the ocean, you don't see anything but water. The same thing is when Mashiach is going to come, when we're going to look around us, we're not going to see anything except the knowledge of God Almighty. We're going to see nothing besides godliness. And what that means practically is that every human being is going to spend their entire time and their entire occupation is going to be in learning about godliness. It's going to be learning the Torah. It's going to be learning about godliness, and learning about God Almighty Himself. And that is what the entire occupation of the world is going to be. So now we can understand, for example, that any type of practice or behavior that distracts us from seeing the importance of the occupation of our minds and our hearts into the service of God Almighty and into learning about God Almighty is something that's a distraction. That's something that we want to discourage every human being from, because what the person is doing is that they are basically distracting themselves from reality. They're getting involved in a temporal experience and they're losing sight of a better use of their time. So while the commandments, on one hand, seem to be written for the children of Israel, if we delve more deeply into them, these particular commandments here, don't go in the ways of the nations, right? So you're going to say, well, how? What about a non-Jew? He's a member of the nations. Don't go in the way of the nations. Well, yes, because we're talking about the nations' behaviors as they are when they're not aware, when they're not conscious, when they're not focused on their godly purpose in the world. So then no human being should go in that type of behavior. So what we're bringing out over here, and we're going to see that Rabbi Steif is going to bring this out. It's quite a long one. It's going to take a couple of weeks to go through all the different details here. But at the end, he's going to say this behavior that we're saying a Jew should stay away from, because a Jew doesn't want to get involved in activities that are connected with idolatry and immorality and wastes of time. So also a non-Jew should not be engaged in those activities. So let's go in further over here. We covered last week the verses, and we covered don't start to dress like the people who are the non-Jews that are connected to idolatry. And remember, we're saying over here, this is obviously different than the commandment don't get involved in idolatry. So we know that it's forbidden to worship idols for a Jew and a non-Jew. We know it's forbidden to, wear the ornaments of idolatry and so forth. So that's already been covered. What we're talking about over here is where a person is going to say, oh, he's not going to worship idols. He's not going to wear an object of idolatry, but he's going to wear the clothing that idolaters might wear. Or he's going to do his hair like the idolaters do. Or he's going to, for example, we had a prohibition last week of not wearing clothing, argamon, which is a type of red clothing, which is that people should not wear because it's associated with licentiousness, like with immorality, with trying to break down the boundaries of proper human conduct. So therefore, no human being should wear these colors and so forth. Okay, so now let's go and delve inside over here, and we'll see that we are up to chapter 38 on page 351, and we're up to Gimel over here. The third paragraph, Lo yigal tzitzis reishei shelo lidmos lahem b'sa'era. Don't grow the corners of the fringes of his hair on his head, that he should not be emulating the conduct of the way non-Jews do their haircuts. Lo yigaleach matzdadim, don't shave from the sides of the head. V'yaniach se'ar be'emtza hareish hanikra b'loiris, and leave a centerpiece. So the whole head would be shaved on the sides, and it would be the center of the head would be left with hair. Don't do that. Lo yigaleach se'ar mekeneged panav be'ezen le'ezen v'yaniach per melachav. Don't shave off the hair on the back of his head from ear to ear. So don't make like a shaving across the back and then leave some part of it. I'm not sure exactly what this is describing over here, but some part of it afterwards. This is, and actually a person who does one of these things receives lashes, because he is not openly worshiping idols, but he's starting to dress and do things like the idolaters. Daled, paragraph 4. There is a interesting point over here to bring to our attention. Shemishu korov l'malchus, a Jewish person who is close to the kingship. He's, let's say, an advisor to the king, or he has some role in the king's courtyard, close to the king, and he needs to dress in the dress of the people that are in service of the king, so like whatever the traditional garb is, and to emulate them in the dress, b'miktsas, a little bit, then that's permissible. So the general concept is over here that notice that he's saying b'miktsas, a little bit. He can't go all out and dress exactly like them, but in order for him to be able to accomplish his work that he has in trying to guide the kingdom, the non-Jewish king, to conduct the kingdom properly and so forth, then he could wear clothing that is somewhat similar, so that he is fitting in more. This is one exception, but he cannot obviously wear objects of idolatry. He cannot do acts of idolatry. He cannot do things that are, God forbid, like that. But this area where we're saying stay away from this completely, from this way of dressing. If a person is needing to travel for the benefit of the Jewish people in the the halls of the king of the governing power in order to advocate for the Jewish people, then he could wear he could emulate the clothing that is the prevailing custom of the time somewhat. That would be permissible, but that's a very small exception. Hey, 5. Lo yelach lamakom shehem mitzkapsim shehem v'meishvam kamoy teatriot v'karkasayis. Do not go to the places that the non-Jews are gathering together to sit. And they have these, like in their settlements, in their cities, they have these gathering places. Como, for example, like theaters and circuses. Now, for people in modern times where everyone's brought up on entertainment, this may seem like a very dramatic instruction over here, and it might be hard for people to contemplate not going to theaters and not going to circuses. That theaters would include live performances and movie performances, and circuses, obviously we know what those are. So let's understand what's actually happening in the theaters and what's actually happening in the circuses. And this would also apply to things like the Colosseum in Rome and places that are gathered, people are gathering together, because the reason that people are gathering together is not for holy purposes. They're gathering together in the theaters. People think it's entertainment, but we have two problems with the entertainment. One is the fact of the entertainment, and one is the content of the entertainment. So the fact of the entertainment is that a person is going to waste a tremendous amount of their time. You have to travel to the theater. You have to sit in the theater. You're not going to be there for less than a couple hours. And then you're going to travel back. You've just taken a major portion of a day that God Almighty has gifted you with, that you could be in service to God, in service to your fellow human being, and you could be learning about God Almighty's divine wisdom, and you've just squandered it to entertain yourself. So this is hugely problematic. It's interesting that the prevalence of these type of entertainments correspond to the decay of the civilization. So we go to these places, we see these massive colosseums and so forth, and the bigger the theaters, the bigger the colosseums, that corresponds to the decline of the civilization. Because whereas people in the upswing of civilization, when civilization is being built, people are hard at work, occupying themselves with important activities to generate products and services that are of service to other people. They're involved with contemplating important concepts about how should a proper society govern itself. What is God Almighty's will for people? What is God Almighty's divine wisdom? What are the principles and the rules that society has to be governed by, and writing and speaking about this and discussing this with their friends and their colleagues and so forth. That's the occupation of people who are busy building civilization. But once civilization reaches a certain point, people start to decide that they don't need to occupy themselves in that, because they start to feel that everything's okay. Everything is just fine, right? You've got sewer systems by that time, and you have food supplies, and you have a governance system. So people decide that now they could take their foot off the gas, so to speak, and they want to have leisure. They want to relax. The end result of this relaxing, though, is that they lose focus. So instead of spending that 5 hours or 3 hours of time thinking about what's the proper character traits of a human being, what's the proper character traits of a government, what's the proper character traits of a civilization, they're busy waiting. They're basically in entertainment. What's leisure and entertainment about? It's about a person turns off their productive interaction with God and with other human beings, and they say they want to now, instead of being a giver, you want to be a receiver. The Torah is saying A person always has to be in a process of giving. We have what to give. God Almighty is giving to me divine energy. I have to be constantly giving. When I go to a place and I say, I'm turning off my givingness and I'm now going to receive, how would you like to entertain me? I'm going to sit back in the chair and you're going to do some performance. I have flipped the role that I'm supposed to be playing in civilization. So now you take, if it's one person that's involved in leisure and no longer contributing, you have one person just disconnected. If you have now 100,000 people gathered in a stadium, you have 100,000 people. Now, today, you have the entire population, or a large part of the population, is involved in the theatrics. They're watching football games. In America, there's something called Monday Night Football, I think it's called, and people watch football. They watch men chasing a ball back and forth on the screen, and they sit around, and this is what they think about, and this is what they talk about, and they debate it, and they get excited about it, and they cry about it, and this is a whole process of their lives of squandering this time, this energy, this divine energy that they're meant to be invested in learning about God Almighty. Or even if they're not going to learn about God Almighty, but if they would just turn off the television and sit and focus on each other, perhaps some people want to come together. What are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about what needs to be improved in their society, what needs to be improved in their town, how they can improve their families. The situation has gotten so bad, it's so deteriorated that people are not just going to the Colosseum. I don't know how often people went to the Colosseum in Rome, or the theaters in England, or in Paris, and these kind of places. I don't know how often they went. But now it's become like it's become a 24 hours a day, 7-day a week theater system. People are eating, they don't even eat meals together as a family. They're watching television together. This is destroying the human being. It's not just destroying the fabric between the people that should be focused on each other, but what it's doing is detaching the human being from his necessary enthusiastic involvement in improving his situation, his family situation, and the world, by uplifting everybody, by bringing something new that's going to be of value to everybody. So this is what happens when you spend your time on these leisure activities. And if you were to go inside the schedule of a Torah observant Jew, the primary use of his time, obviously a person has to sleep, and he has to take care of his bodily needs, and he has to raise his children and help his wife, and be able to make sure that his family has the sustenance it needs. But every other free moment is devoted to learning God Almighty's divine wisdom, and says that a person is not allowed to be mevatl Torah. He's not allowed to take away bittul Torah. It means to say he's nullifying the Torah. He is not learning. If any time person has free time, he doesn't have another pressing obligation, a mitzvah, a commandment that he has to fulfill. Feeding your family is a commandment. When any moment that he doesn't have that need, then he has to be occupying his mind in the divine, and that's called Torah study. And a human being, every human being, we see the Ramah Mefano says that one of the commandments that applies, of the 30 commandments that applies to all the non-Jews, one is learning the Torah that applies to the non-Jews, and a person who learns the Torah that applies to the non-Jews, a non-Jew who learns Torah is like the high priest in the holy temple, in the holy city, in the holy land. So talk about the greatest fulfillment of a person's purpose in the world is to learn the Torah that applies to them. So when a person says that they are not going to learn Torah, they don't have any other obligation. If a person's at a football game or at a theater or at a movie, they don't have to make the food. They don't have to cook the food. They don't have to grow the food. They don't have to work to put food on the table. They don't have to, they've got free time, but they are not occupying their energy as God Almighty would have them do that. So that just goes into that's just in terms of the time. And people will say, oh, but it's nice to spend time together as a family. But there's other things you could do is spend time as a family. Much more family time. Family time is not looking at someone else chasing a ball. Family time would be you go as a family and chase a ball. If that's how you want to spend time and use your energy, and you want to put a ball down on the grass and chase it around, then do that as a family. You want to do something that's going to be interesting, then fly a kite. You like drama, then make a skit with your family members. Work together, and each person will play a part, and you'll play out some interesting skit. You'll reenact some funny experience from your lives. This is how you could spend your time. Meaning to say, even if you're not at a place and a level of grasping the importance of learning Torah, but you could do a lot more things besides watching theater and watching movies and TV and going to sports games. There's a lot more things you could do with your time that's going to be much more building your family, connecting your family. And civilization is dependent on the family. There is no civilization if the families are dispersed and distracted and falling apart, or they're not connected. So that goes as to the time. So therefore it says, don't gather together in these places, the theaters and the circuses. Now that just goes as to the use of the time, but let's talk about what the content is. So the theaters have been always the place of the most debased and demoralized people, who by definition are not spending their time on a constructive, productive contribution to society. Rather, they are either involved in making fun of people, they're involved in spreading despair, and trying to use the theater to advance and promote their religious viewpoints and their their religion and their philosophies and immorality. So if you go back to the history of theater, you'll find that it's always been a cesspool of revolutionary activity, because the people who wanted to overthrow the king or overthrow the system of morality in any country, the way to get people's attention is through the theaters. And the way to do that is, you can't come out and, if you put out a piece of paper that says overthrow the king, then the king, if he's a wise king and he has the proper systems in place to keep the people directed towards building civilization and not tearing it down, then he would discover that quickly through his officers that are making sure that the people are focused on building and not on destroying. And that person who published it would be discovered and arrested, and the consequences would be the consequences. So you can't put out papers very easily overthrowing the government. But what you could do is you can make a theater. And in the theater, you can't come out and say, chant, overthrow the king, down with the king, down with the king. That's also going to get outlawed. But you could put in some very subtle snickering comments about the king and the king's wife and the king's courtiers and the king's son, and not about this king, of course, but about kings in general, and start to undermine the respect that people have for the king. Now, the king, we know there's always been bad kings, but the king is an institution of a person who's taken responsibility for the well-being of everyone in the society, and he wants to, and his every waking moment and his every sleeping moment of a real king is concerned about uplifting the people and uplifting them spiritually and making sure they have everything they need physically and creating prosperity for everybody. And he's kind of like the hub of that. He's the heart of the nation, and he's the hub of that activity. That's what he wants to make sure everyone's doing well. So the revolutionaries want to push an agenda to tear all that down. So what better thing than get everyone to come and sit and then be in a receiving mode, and then you are going to hear whatever you're going to hear, and that's going to affect you, because whatever you see and hear, you always remember. You may not be able to recall it, but you'll never forget anything you see or hear, and that will start to tear away at the fabric of your existence. So my father, Olav Shalom, would always say he never let us have a television in the house. And he said, why would I want to open a sewer line directly into my living room? Because you have some person with some twisted mindset that's sitting in a studio somewhere thinking about how he can undermine the family, how he can fight against God, how he could spread immorality. And he's just coming up with little ways to insert that according to what will not be too offensive. Just pushing the lines, pushing the borders enough, that breaking down the borders enough, boundaries of decency and morality enough that people won't turn it off, and they just watch it and they laugh at it, and it's obviously titillating. Everyone is going to be curious to see something on the edges of propriety, and everyone's going to be curious to see pictures of things that are not good for them. Everyone's going to laugh at a joke that puts someone else down, or makes fun of something that's valuable, or makes fun of morality. And we see that's what happens. My father had the wisdom, thank God, not to let that into the house. But if you look, for example, in America, there was a very popular cartoon series called The Simpsons on TV. I mean, it's a war against God. That whole thing is a war against God, disrespecting the parents. What's one of the divine commandments that applies to every single human being is to honor your mother and father. And The Simpsons was mocking parents, mocking parenthood, and destroying both the kids' respect to the parents, and ultimately the people who watch it, the adults who watch it, also have weakened their own sense of authority as parents. And then those kids that watched it grew up to be very much struggling to be parents, because if they grew up mocking parents, what kind of parent could you be if you don't have respect for the concept of being a mother or father? So we see, for example, in this vein, that, let's say in Italy, where the Catholic Church had a very strong hold, and the Catholic Church was talking about things, obviously we know that they were talking about things that are not in accordance with Torah, but they did have some teachings that were in accordance with Torah, discouraging immorality and so forth, because they did learn or teach some biblical concepts. But what would happen is, in the theaters and in the operas, people who were writing those and performing those were people who were trying to fight against in the knowledge of God, and fight against morality. So what they would do is they would create a play that would go too far, and the church censors would review it, and then they would say that's not acceptable. So then they would wind back in the script, in the opera lyrics and so forth. They would in the script for the play or the opera, whatever the opera or opera play, ballets, or whatever the type of performance is, they would dial it back so it would keep the anti-God message and the anti-morality message more hidden, so it would just get past the censors. And even if there were no active censors, but the church would then get, or people in general would be offended by it. So they had to just always keep at the leading edge of immorality and disrespect, but they always would advance it a little bit more than what was acceptable the year before. Because once people become comfortable with the current level of irreverence, then you can always push them to the next level. And this is what entertainment does. And this is what entertainment is designed to do. So it's saying over here, don't go to these places. Because the place is built and designed for this purpose. It doesn't just say here, don't go to non-kosher, don't go to, anti-God or anti-morality productions in the theaters. Don't go to the theaters at all, because you will come to see things that will disrupt your reverence, your connection to God Almighty. And the same thing with the circuses. The circuses, what are the circuses? The circuses are performances, the level, the immodesty and the improper dress and all the different things that are going on in the circuses are not appropriate for any human being to see. So people justify it by saying it's fascinating, it's interesting, it entertains the kids, but it's intended to break down morality. It's intended to show a mode of dress and activity that is inappropriate. And then people are going to start to say, well, it's okay in the circus, it's okay in the streets. So the theaters and the circuses has always been the gathering place of the people with the lowest moral standards in every society. And one of the tragedies of our times is that, even the Torah schooling systems have started to think that it's a good idea. It's very important to learn Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare is such an, his writing style is so great. So I did not let my kids take Shakespeare in the Beis Yaakov. I had them exempted from that. But I faced a tremendous argument from the principal of the Beis Yaakov, who insisted to me that it was vital for a Jewish girl to learn Shakespeare. And she said, I was like, what's so important about Shakespeare? She's like, well, it's such good writing, and there's so many important lessons that Shakespeare has in those writings. And I tried to explain to her that anything that Shakespeare said that's true is already included in the Torah. If you want to learn important lessons, you could learn the books of the Torah, the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. You could learn all the books of the Torah, and you can learn about all the examples of what type of behavior worked out well for people, what type of behavior didn't work out well for people. You can learn the book of Proverbs by King Solomon and learn all his wise statements, divinely inspired wise statements about what is the most important thing to be focused on life and what's not important to be focused on life. And the same with the book of Ecclesiastes, Koheles. And you could learn the book of Eicha, Lamentations, to learn about what happens when people go away from morality and what kind of destruction results. You could spend a whole lifetime learning those things. You don't need Shakespeare, because what people don't recognize is if you start to research Shakespeare's own personal life, you see that he was a person that was not on a high moral standard at all. And the whole theater scene is not a high standard. It's the lowest standard, as a matter of fact, because the average person that is dedicated to building a family and working is busy in the daytime working, and the nighttime is busy with his family. But the theater is for people who are not busy with their family and not busy with other meaningful occupations. And therefore they have all night to do performances and to do practices and sit around and do inappropriate things. And that's the same in every culture, not just English culture. So while one part of English culture was building itself up and creating industry and creating things that benefited humanity and creating higher insights into God Almighty's divine creation, people were busy figuring out the laws of physics and all how the steam engine should work and stuff like that. Other people were busy doing nothing and mocking and writing plays and dragging people down and pushing the limits of what's acceptable and what's tolerable, and then undermining that entire civilization. So we have to stay away from these things, because you cannot possibly censor these things. So, for example, I try to explain to these teachers in these English programs, what they do is, how does it work in a Torah school? That they give these kids literature to read, tragically, give the Jewish kids literature to read. So they censor it. How do they censor it? They take out any reference to Jesus. They take out any reference that would be a directly sexual reference, and they'll actually black it out or delete that page or whatever it is. but they leave everything else in. They don't understand that the whole context is promoting idolatry or immorality. You don't need to mention the name of an idol to promote idolatry, to promote concepts that go against the service of God Almighty. And what Rabbi Steif is bringing over here is for this halacha, for this commandment, the way every human being should conduct themselves, is that we have to understand that we are not in a position to go into an environment that is designed to fight against God and to fight against morality and say, I can handle this. Listen, I'm a rabbi. I know the difference between right and wrong. I could let myself be exposed to this. I could say, this is wrong and this is right. And I could say, I'm not going to read this page. And I'm going to close my eyes during this scene in the movie. I'm going to close my eyes during this scene in the theater. So Rabbi, the Torah is telling us, no, it's not possible. You have to stay away from the place completely. Don't go near the theaters. Don't go near the circuses. This is not good for your soul. Because you can't possibly do censorship to cut out the stuff, because you're only going to cut out the stuff that is shocking to your eyes or ears, but you're not going to cut out the rest of the stuff, the whole milieu, the whole atmosphere, the whole mockery, the whole attitude. And plus, the entire experience is a waste of time. It's taking away from the service of God Almighty. So what are you doing there in the first place? So the answer is, we cannot go into the theaters. We cannot go to the circuses. And you have to extend that also to the sports, because the same concept is applying. There's immodest clothing there. They have sometimes, a lot of the sports games, they have actual whole productions of immodesty. Both the concept of cheerleaders, or the people that are performing the sports are not dressed modestly. Or now we see that they have these halftime shows that are completely immodest. So you could see, what are they doing? They're taking people, innocent people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people at the Super Bowl, let's say, football game in America. And the people think they're just going for football. Okay, now, however, it's no longer about the football. It's about what propaganda, what anti-God and anti-morality messages can be inserted into the minds of the people who are open-minded, open-eyed, eager to absorb whatever is going to be thrown at them during this game. So they have the commercials are all pushing immorality and pushing new frontiers of war against civilization, war against God. And the halftime shows are all pushing that. So a person signs up and he puts this on his TV and he gathers all his friends together. He goes to the game itself, and he's now become part of a cultural experience that is actually coming to demolish the very civilization that has benefited him so much that he has the ability to have time to do something like go and watch this game. So you see how built into this is the intent to demolish civilization. Because once people are no longer focused on building civilization, they're now willing to be entertained, which is an act of just receiving what someone else designed as the halftime show or the commercial or the movie or the TV show or the theater or the ballet or the opera or even the orchestras, even the music. The music is also, if you start listening to the late 1800s, it becomes like a destructive music. It's no longer even pleasant to listen to. It's all pushing the lines of how to demolish and deconstruct what's beautiful and what's spiritual. And of course, when you get to more modern music in the 1950s and 1960s, but even before that, the music was not modest. So we have to make a decision. So this is where, you see, this is where we set the rudders of our lives. When a person starts to drift into these things, then he will end up in idolatry and immorality. Because first of all, this is entertaining. And at first he says he's not really doing these immoral things. He's just watching some made up story about someone doing the immoral things. So he doesn't think it really is something that he's doing that's improper. But then his mind is thinking about it, and he starts to fantasize about it, and he starts to think it's acceptable. And once he thinks it's entertaining and acceptable in that context, then he now starts to think it's okay if people around him are doing those things. It's no longer part of the entertainment system. It's actually part of the society around him. And the next thing he knows that he and his kids and his wife and his family are involved in it. So the end result is that civilization collapses. And this has repeated itself in every time in history. The only way to prevent that decay is to say, we don't have time for decay. If my food can come to my table in 5 hours of work or 8 hours of work instead of 16 hours of work a day, then that's a blessing, because now I could use that difference of 8 hours for studying Torah, for spending time with my family, for discussing how to improve the well-being of people around us. That's how we're going to use our time. We're not using it for entertainment. So I think that we've discussed this a little bit, touched on this past, but we see that this is something that's really, really essential. We can't discuss it enough. And the message has to get out there. People simply have to turn this off. And at first it's difficult. And you might say, I want to say, I cannot go to these things, but think about it. Think about the consequences in your life. Think about what you are coming out with in terms of a reduction in your reverence, coming out with a reduction in your connection to God Almighty from each one of these experiences, seeing and hearing things that are not appropriate. And I want to suggest that every person that's watching this needs to we need to be the front line warriors of fighting for God Almighty, fighting for the well-being of our fellow human beings, fighting for the well-being of our families. So if you have a television, you have to I want to suggest that the right thing to do is set yourself a goal. I understand that, we have to work within the facts of humanity. If you can throw the TV out the door today and cancel your subscriptions by the way, watching the news is part of this. Okay, the news is also a form of entertainment that is meant to twist your mind and your soul. So you'll discover that you're going to react to it. What are the kids going to do? Well, the kids are going to be quote unquote bored, and they're going to discover new and better things to do with their time. And you're going to feel, what am I going to do with my time? You're going to discover that first you're going to think you're going to go to your mind. And then what you're going to discover is that you have a mind. Because when you turn these things off, you're going to be left alone with yourself. You're going to be, who's this nice person that I'm living with? Who are the nice people I could go and spend time with? What other interesting things can I learn how to do? And how can I devote myself to the learning of God Almighty's divine wisdom? This is what you open yourself up to, an entirely new experience. And the day that the televisions and the entertainment, all these things we're talking about have now been brought in our cell phones right into our house. People are carrying them in their bedrooms, and they're going to sleep with them, and they're waking up with them. And this is creating it's really destroying the reverence of people, and it's destroying the ability of the mind to even focus. You can't have a clarity of mind if your mind is distracted, and you cannot possibly take any action if your mind is distracted. You just, this guy said this, and this guy said this, and it's all interesting that if you watch the news, it's all one expert saying, quote unquote expert saying this, and this is going to happen, that's going to happen, and it always revolves around explaining other people's actions and explaining what other people are going to do, but it never tells you what you have to do to change in order to bring about a better result in the world. So I want to encourage you to go through, your cell phones need to be not coming to your bedrooms, and you need to be off when they're as much as possible in your home, and you need to be thinking, get rid of the televisions, and the kids programming is the worst of all. I don't let my kids even watch the video productions for kids that are made by Torah observant people, because they're trying to emulate and entertain with the same style and the same quick moving images and the quick adrenaline type stuff and mockery and so forth that they think is needed to emulate what's out there in the world. And a lot of them come from backgrounds where that was their whole style. They weren't originally religious, and they trying to make that in a kosher way and a clean way for the Torah world. So we don't need any of that. So what I want to encourage you to do is take stock, make a list of these things. Let's start with making a list. Make a list of all the ways in which you attend the theaters and circuses. and then say to yourself, what can you start to reduce? Make a goal to take out one thing off the list. And even if you feel that it's not something this week that you could take off the list, but it is something that you're going to start reducing. So you're going to reduce it, and then you're going to reduce it, and you're going to start to discover that you have all of a sudden time, and you have a mind, and you have a heart, and there's other people with minds and hearts around you. You're going to discover a much more beautiful, much more wonderful world. And what's going to happen automatically in the absence of all these negative influences, your reverence, your connection to God Almighty is going to increase. You don't have, well, we say we need to learn Torah because Torah is telling us the right things to do and helps us improve our character traits. And well, just getting rid of the negative influences will flourish in you a positive influence, because the positive influence is coming from within you. Finish with one point I would like to share, something I saw incredible from the Mitzvos Emes, holy book, holy sefer, the Mitzvos Emes, written by the Ger Rebbe, who's called by the name of this sefer called the Mitzvos Emes. The words of truth, lips of truth, the speech of truth. I want to translate the name of this holy book. But he says like this in the Parshas Lech Lecha that we just read this past Shabbos, Parshas Lech Lecha. God Almighty says to Avram, you should go out, Lech Lecha. You should go from your land. You should go from your background, your birth, place of your birth, whole style of your upraising, and from the house of your father. So the Ramban asks a question. How is that God Almighty, the Torah just says, all of a sudden, who's Avram? We know from the previous Parsha a little bit about him. He's the son of Terach, and okay, very little details. So how is the Torah just comes and God Almighty says to him, you, go out. God Almighty said to Avram, go from your land, from your place of your birth, and from the house of your father to the land I will show you. Shouldn't there be some sort of introduction? Shouldn't there be some talk about how God loved Avram? It was Avram at the time before it became Avraham. God loved him, and he's a special person, like we see by Noach. To go before God Almighty starts talking to Noach and giving him instructions, he says, these are the generations of Noach. He was an Ish Tzaddik. He was a special person, a righteous man, perfect and complete. And he, in his generation, and God walked with Noach, helped him, was together with Noach. Now that's a proper introduction. Who is he? How chiba? What's the chiba? What's the special love that God has for this person? And now God could tell us what he told him. So it should be the same thing with Avram Avinu. Should be. Avram was so special, and God felt a special love for him, and he wants to tell him, go out of your house, go to your land, go to your place you grew up, and now go to your father's house, and you go to the land. I'm going to show you I love you so much, Avram. So Mitzvos Emes brings in the name of the Zohar, quotes from the Zohar that says, the reason that doesn't say anything, no introduction like that about how much God Almighty loves Avram is because the message that came to Avram was not as a result of God's love for Avram. This is a message that's coming to every human being from God Almighty directly at every single moment. There was nothing special about this message to Avram. It's coming to every single human being. What was special and the why it's recorded in the Torah is because Avraham listened to the message. And because he listened to the message, then he received all the blessings that came from listening to the message. But every human being can also hear the message. And it's being said to each one of us right now. Every single human being is being spoken to by God Almighty with the same message. And we all can listen to it. So, going back to what we're discussing here today, to hear that message, you have to cut out all the static, all the noise, all the background noise that's distracting you, and you're chasing after this thing, and you have to watch this TV show, and you have to go to the sports game. I have to do all these things. These are all coming to distract you from hearing God Almighty's message. So when you turn them off, and even as you start to reduce them because you want to turn them off eventually completely. But if you feel you can't turn them off all today, or let's say you're in a family where your spouse or other people in the house are not ready for a complete turning it off, but as you turn it off and you set yourself an example that you're sitting there quietly in your chair, just thinking, then you will start to hear God Almighty's divine voice. God Almighty speaking to you. And then you'll have the opportunity to start to listen. And then you'll open a Torah book and you'll learn about better character traits. And while the rest of your family's watching the TV, you'll be sitting at the table in a nice way. You're not going to be snobbish to them. You're not going to say nasty things to them, God forbid, because that's against the Torah. But you're going to sit and learn something inspiring, and saying to them afterwards, you'll say, I see you enjoyed the TV show. Let me tell you about something that I learned. And then share with them an inspiring, uplifting message. And eventually the whole atmosphere of your home will shift. The whole atmosphere of your neighborhood, your family, the culture, the civilization will shift to where we are busy occupying ourselves solely with the knowledge of God Almighty. That will be the sole occupation of every single human being. I want to bless you all with a beautiful week. This week, Mitzvos Hashem, should be the best week of your life. Starting right now, see what you could do to cut out the outside influences, and just know that there's good things in store for you. God bless you all. Thank you very much for being here.